The wind howled across the frozen plains of Veridian 9, rattling the thin walls of the solitary hut that stood like a stubborn sentinel against the endless white. Snow whipped in spirals, driven by a storm that had been building for hours. Inside, Kale, a human settler, worked tirelessly to repair the door latch, knowing the storm could tear it apart in moments if it remained weak. His fingers were numb despite his gloves, and his breath fogged the small, dimly lit room. Yet Kale felt a quiet satisfaction in the small victories of survival. Out here, alone in the harsh expanse of a frozen world, every simple repair, every bit of firewood stacked just so, was a testament to human endurance. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed outside. Kale froze, his heart quickening. The wind had carried the sound, but it was not the usual moan of ice or shifting snow. This was deliberate, something alive, moving with purpose. He gripped the hammer in his hand and cautiously stepped toward the door. A shadow passed across the thin window pane. Then the door shuddered violently, as if something outside had tried to force its way in. Kale's instincts told him to prepare for danger, but another part of him recognized fear and desperation in the motion. Whoever or whatever it was, they were not attacking randomly. They were seeking shelter. Kale flung the door open against the storm, the icy wind biting at his face. At the threshold, crouched in the snow, was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. She had slender limbs covered in a shimmering, scaled skin that reflected the storm's pale light. Her eyes were large, liquid, and golden, flickering with terror. She tried to speak, emitting a series of rapid musical tones that Kale could not understand. Panic radiated from her, coiling around her like a living thing. Without thinking, Kale reached out. "Come in," he shouted over the roar of the storm. The alien recoiled, as if his presence was as dangerous as the storm outside. Kale stepped back, holding out his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just come inside. You'll freeze out there." She hesitated, glancing at the snow that tore across the landscape, her golden eyes wide with indecision. Finally, with a sudden, desperate leap, she scrambled past him and into the hut, collapsing against the wall. Snowflakes fell from her scaled skin, melting on the wooden floorboards. Her breaths were sharp, shallow gasps, and she trembled violently. Kale closed the door against the blizzard, sealing them in, and lit the small heater at the corner of the room. Warmth spread slowly, and the alien shivered, curling into herself, still wary of him. Kale studied her carefully. She was smaller than a human, with delicate features that contrasted sharply with the harsh survivalist world outside. Her skin was strange, almost liquid in appearance, yet it radiated a subtle strength. He had encountered many alien species before, traders, explorers, even refugees, but never someone so clearly alone and terrified. His mind raced with questions. How had she come to Veridian 9? Why was she running from the storm rather than traveling in a group? And most pressing, what kind of danger had she faced that made her so afraid of him? He took a step closer, careful not to startle her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." She flinched at his voice, pressing back into the wall. Kale realized that words alone would not bridge the gap between them. He needed to show her, not tell her. Slowly, he began pulling firewood from the stack by the wall, feeding the flames. The warmth spread quickly, and he noticed her tense posture relax slightly as the room grew more hospitable. Then he removed a pack of dried rations from the shelf. Holding them out with a gentle gesture, he offered her some food. She looked at it suspiciously, then at him, then back at the food. Hunger overcame caution, and she reached out with a trembling hand to take a piece. For a moment, silence reigned. The only sound was the storm's fury outside and the crackling of the fire. Kale studied her more closely and realized she was shivering not from cold alone. Her eyes darted constantly to the walls as if expecting danger to burst through them. It was fear of him, fear of humans. He felt a pang of understanding. Humans had a reputation across the galaxy. Some species believed them to be reckless, violent, unpredictable. But Kale knew the truth. Humans survived because they adapted, because they cared, because they could be both cunning and compassionate when circumstances demanded it. "Can you understand me?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. She shook her head, her golden eyes wide and uncertain. Kale sighed, realizing communication would be slow, laborious, but not impossible. He gestured to the fire, then pointed at himself. She watched carefully, trying to mimic his movements. Slowly, painfully, she pointed to herself, then to him. Then haltingly, she repeated a single word that sounded like a whisper in his ears. "Kale," he smiled faintly. "Close enough," he said. "I'm Kale." "You can call me that if you want." She repeated the word softly, testing the sound against her own tongue. A small spark of trust flickered in her eyes. Hours passed as the storm raged outside. Kale taught her basic gestures, and she responded with cautious curiosity. He learned her name was Lyra, though he had no way of confirming the pronunciation. Through shared movements and mimed actions, he learned that she had fled from a research expedition gone wrong, that her kind was not hostile, and that she had been stranded in this icy wilderness after her shuttle had malfunctioned. Her fear of humans, he realized, came from stories and warnings from her people. Yet, observing her reactions, Kale noticed something else, an instinctive admiration for human ingenuity. She watched how he used simple tools to reinforce the hut, how he maintained the fire, how he rationed food. It was a quiet acknowledgement that humans were capable of solving problems that her species might struggle with. As the night deepened, the wind outside became a monstrous roar, shaking the hut as if it might collapse under the storm's fury. Kale kept the fire going, fetched more wood, and checked the door and windows. Lyra huddled against the wall, her wide eyes never leaving him. At one point, she reached out and touched his arm briefly, then retracted, as if testing whether his warmth was real. Kale gave a gentle nod, letting her know she was safe. A fragile bond began to form, a mutual recognition of need and resilience. Suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched shriek pierced the storm. Both Kale and Lyra froze. The sound was unnatural, echoing across the frozen plains, carried by the wind. Lyra's body tensed, and she pressed closer to Kale. The human's mind raced. The sound could belong to a predator, or worse, to a scavenger capable of breaching a hut. He grabbed a long, sturdy pole and positioned it near the door, ready to defend. "Stay behind me," he said firmly. Lyra nodded, trembling, but she obeyed. In that moment, Kale understood the full extent of the challenge ahead. Not just surviving the storm, but surviving whatever dangers the storm might have driven to their doorstep. The hours dragged on. Every sound, every gust of wind that slammed against the walls, set them both on edge. Kale kept speaking softly, telling Lyra about his homeworld, about humans, about survival, using simple words, gestures, and demonstration. She listened, absorbing the information, occasionally nodding or attempting to mimic the gestures. He realized that despite the fear, there was curiosity there, a spark that humans often ignited in others without even trying. He also realized that this spark could grow into trust, and perhaps even friendship if nurtured carefully. By the time the first pale light of morning crept over the horizon, the storm had not yet subsided, but a lull had arrived. Lyra's shivering lessened, and she began to explore the hut cautiously, touching objects, examining tools, and occasionally glancing at Kale for reassurance. He watched with quiet pride. In the harshness of Viridian 9, humanity's true strength shone not just in survival, but in empathy, in the ability to reach out across fear, species, and language to help another being endure. That, he realized, was why humans could thrive where others might falter. Adaptation and ingenuity were important, yes, but so was heart. Kale decided to prepare a more secure shelter within the hut, improvising barriers and traps in case the storm and its creatures returned. He explained his actions to Lyra, pointing at each trap, demonstrating how it worked. She watched closely, fascination overcoming fear in fleeting moments. It was small, simple, and human, yet extraordinary from her perspective. When she finally smiled, hesitant, shy, but genuine, Kale allowed himself a brief relief. For the first time since she had arrived, it seemed possible that she might survive this blizzard not just because of herself, but because of humanity's resilience beside her. And then from somewhere outside, deeper in the storm, came another sound, a low, guttural growl unlike anything Kale had ever heard. It was closer this time. Lyra froze, gripping the wall, her scales bristling. Kale's grip tightened on the pole. The storm had not brought just wind and snow. Something else had arrived with it, something large, dangerous, and curious. The survival test was far from over. But for the first time, Kale felt that he would not face it alone. The alien woman who had fled into his hut, terrified at the sight of him, might yet become an ally in the fight against Viridian 9 itself. Kale glanced at Lyra. She met his eyes, fear still there, but no longer as paralyzing. Trust was tentative, fragile, but it existed. And together they would endure whatever the storm, and whatever else had in store. The growl outside was low, almost like the earth itself was warning them, and it carried through the walls of Kale's hut with a vibration that made both human and alien tense. The snowstorm had quieted, but the sound was more terrifying than the wind ever could be. Kale gripped the pole tightly, every muscle in his body alert. Lyra crouched behind him, her golden eyes wide and unblinking, watching the shadows that danced across the walls as the storm light flickered through the hut's small windows. Kale's mind worked quickly. The hut was not strong enough to withstand a direct assault, and neither of them was equipped for a fight with whatever beast prowled outside. He needed a plan, something simple but effective. Survival had always required improvisation, and humans were masters of it. He gestured to Lyra to stay low and quiet, pointing toward the fire and the tools stacked along the walls. Slowly, carefully, he began moving. Outside, the growl came again, closer now. The snow shifted as something massive pushed through it, leaving deep, uneven tracks. Kale's eyes narrowed. This creature was intelligent enough to track them through the storm. It was patient, waiting for an opening. The thought made his stomach tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic would not save them. Only strategy and action would. He picked up a lantern and moved to the small entranceway, tilting it to see through the gaps in the door. The creature's shape was huge, hunched low, with jagged limbs that tore through the snow with terrifying speed. Its skin shimmered faintly, almost transparent under the lantern's glow, revealing muscles that rippled like liquid steel. Kale's mind raced through possibilities. He had seen predators before, but nothing like this. This was not only strong, but cunning. Yet even as fear pressed in, Kale knew humans had one advantage, the ability to improvise under pressure. He returned to the center of the hut, crouching next to Lyra. "Listen to me," he whispered. "We need to make it think the hut is not worth entering." Lyra tilted her head, unsure, but followed his eyes as he pulled out a small bundle of firewood and metal scraps. He began arranging them in a pattern near the door, stacking them carefully to look unstable, like a trap waiting for the creature to stumble. Then he found a piece of wire and attached it to the stack so that if the beast nudged it, the entire thing would collapse and create a loud noise, scaring it. Lyra watched in fascination, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. She did not understand the mechanics entirely, but she understood intent. Humans were clever, and cleverness often meant survival. Hours passed in a tense silence. The creature prowled outside, growling occasionally, testing the hut's strength with quick, calculated attacks. Kale adjusted the traps quietly, never letting his focus waver. He noticed that Lyra was beginning to mimic his actions, cautiously moving objects and arranging simple patterns near the fire and corners, testing her own intuition against the storm's chaos. The alien's natural fear had not vanished, but curiosity and cautious cooperation were emerging. Then the creature lunged. Snow exploded outside the hut as it hit the door with incredible force. Kale braced himself, holding the pole high. The stacked wood collapsed perfectly, scattering metal and wood across the floor with a deafening crash. The creature snarled, startled, and recoiled. Lyra gasped, her tail, or what appeared like a thin, scaled appendage, curling instinctively around her. Kale gave her a brief, encouraging nod. "See, not impossible," he said, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. The storm continued to howl outside, masking their movements. Kale and Lyra worked together to reinforce the hut further. They used every scrap of wood and metal, every leftover tool, and even the heavier furniture, creating layered barriers and obstacles. Kale demonstrated with patience, showing her exactly how to balance weight, how to stabilize structures, how to anticipate the creature's movements. She copied him carefully, and slowly she began to understand. Her fear had not disappeared, but respect for human ingenuity had started to take its place. Night fell again, but Kale did not let the darkness weaken their resolve. The growls had become intermittent, more cautious. The creature had learned to expect resistance. Kale leaned against a wall for a moment, letting out a quiet breath. "You're learning fast," he said to Lyra. She blinked, then tilted her head, a silent acknowledgement. For the first time, he felt that they were not just two beings trapped by a storm, they were a team. As hours dragged on, Kale noticed small changes in Lyra. She began moving closer to the fire voluntarily, sharing warmth instead of hiding in the corner. She mimicked his gestures more confidently, even attempting to replicate the way he had set up traps. There was a subtle intelligence in her eyes, a recognition that humans not only survived by brute strength but by thought, patience, and observation. Kale allowed himself a small smile. Humanity's greatest strength was not just in surviving harsh environments, but in teaching others to survive alongside them. Suddenly, the hut shook violently. The creature had found another weak point, pressing against the wall with massive force. Kale grabbed Lyra's arm. "Move," he shouted, pulling her behind the heaviest furniture. The creature roared, a sound so loud it rattled their bones, then struck the wall again. Kale realized they needed more than passive defense. They needed to actively repel it. He gestured to Lyra, showing her how to use a simple lever made from a wooden pole and a heavy crate. Together, they could swing the crate to hit the wall and create a loud, echoing impact. The creature flinched at the noise, startled by the unexpected counterattack. Lyra's initial hesitation melted into determination. She nodded, gripping the lever with Kale, and together they executed the plan. The crate slammed against the wall, and the creature recoiled once more, growling in frustration. Kale's heart pounded, but he allowed himself a flicker of hope. The alien was beginning to trust him, and together they could defend themselves. Hours passed like this, a tense rhythm of attacks and defenses. Kale learned more about the creature's behavior than he had thought possible. It was intelligent, calculating, and patient, but it had limits. It did not understand improvisation, and it did not anticipate coordinated resistance. Lyra, too, was learning. She noticed the creature's patterns, its hesitations, its small reactions to sound and movement. Her understanding of the situation began to complement Kale's strategy, a subtle partnership forming between human and alien. At dawn, the storm finally began to die down. The creature retreated into the blizzard, leaving deep tracks in the snow, but no further immediate threat. Kale slumped against a wall, exhausted, and Lyra sank beside him. For the first time, silence replaced tension. She looked at him, a mixture of awe and cautious respect in her golden eyes. He smiled faintly. "You did well," he said. She did not reply with words, but the nod she gave was more meaningful than any sentence. Trust had begun to take root, fragile but undeniable. Kale knew the storm was only part of the challenge. The blizzard had tested their ingenuity and courage, but survival on Viridian 9 required more than just enduring natural hazards. There were other dangers, other creatures, and possibly other humans whose intentions might not be friendly. Yet, he also knew something crucial. With cooperation and human adaptability, they could face what came next. Over the following day, Kale and Lyra worked to repair and reinforce the hut fully. Kale taught her basic survival techniques: how to start a fire with minimal fuel, how to reinforce doors and windows, how to ration food and water efficiently. Lyra absorbed the lessons quickly, demonstrating a natural intelligence and an uncanny ability to understand cause and effect. Watching her learn, Kale felt pride, not only in her adaptability, but in what humans could accomplish through teaching and sharing knowledge. By the evening, they had created a small but effective shelter, a bastion against the elements and the creatures that roamed the frozen plains. Kale looked at Lyra, noticing the subtle changes in her demeanor. Fear still lingered, but curiosity and determination were growing. She moved with more confidence, spoke, or rather gestured, with intention and began suggesting improvements to their defenses. It was a partnership now, fragile but real. That night, as the wind outside grew quiet, Kale and Lyra sat near the fire. He shared more about human life, about exploration and survival, using gestures and simple words. She listened intently, occasionally mimicking him, occasionally offering sounds of her own language. Through these exchanges, a silent understanding deepened. Humanity's greatest strength was not merely survival. It was empathy, ingenuity, and the ability to form bonds even in the harshest conditions. Lyra was learning this, experiencing it firsthand, and the respect in her eyes was unmistakable. As Kale drifted into a light sleep, he heard her soft breathing beside him, calm for the first time since the storm began. The storm outside had passed, but a larger journey awaited them. Navigating the frozen plains, facing predators, and eventually reaching a distant human settlement that might offer safety or challenge. He knew the real test was still ahead, but he also knew one crucial truth. Humans could endure, adapt, and overcome, and with Lyra learning from him, they had a real chance together. When he finally closed his eyes fully, he felt a quiet determination. The blizzard had tested them, the creature had challenged them, and fear had shadowed every moment. Yet in the heart of the storm, humanity's resilience had shone through. Lyra, the alien who had fled at the sight of him, now trusted him enough to share the fight. And that trust, fragile as it was, had begun to turn the impossible into something they might just survive. The night passed uneventfully, but the lessons endured. Kale and Lyra would need every skill, every ounce of ingenuity, and every thread of trust if they were to make it across Viridian 9. The storm had tested their courage, but it had also forged a bond. The alien who had once feared humans had seen their strength firsthand, and that realization was only the beginning. By dawn, the frozen horizon stretched endlessly before them, white and unbroken, but no longer threatening in the same way. Kale rose, determined to prepare for the next challenge, and Lyra followed, ready to learn, ready to act. Together, they would face the dangers of the world outside and humanity's reputation. Its courage, its ingenuity, and its heart would grow quietly, like the first light of day breaking through the blizzard. Morning light spread slowly across the frozen plains of Viridian 9. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a silent world covered in deep snow and sharp ice. The air was still dangerous, cold enough to burn exposed skin, but it was calm. Kale stepped outside the hut and scanned the horizon. The tracks of the predator were still visible, leading away into the distance. It had not returned during the night. That alone felt like a small victory. Lyra followed him outside carefully. She squinted against the light, her golden eyes adjusting to the open world. This was the first time she had willingly stepped out beside him instead of hiding behind the door. Kale noticed that and felt a quiet sense of pride. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She stood tall, watching the empty plains with caution and curiosity. Kale pointed toward the far horizon where a faint, dark line cut across the white landscape. "That's where the settlement is," he said. "It's far, but it's our best chance." Lyra did not understand the words, but she followed his gesture. When she looked back at him, she nodded slowly. She trusted his judgment now. They prepared carefully. Kale packed food, water, tools, and emergency supplies. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Lyra watched closely, memorizing each step. She helped where she could, handing him items, copying how he secured straps and balanced weight. By the time they were ready, they moved like partners, not strangers. The journey began under a pale sky. Every step through the snow was slow and tiring. The cold pressed in from all sides, testing their endurance. Kale set the pace, knowing that rushing would only lead to exhaustion. Lyra followed closely, copying his movements, stepping where he stepped, conserving energy just as he did. Human survival techniques, simple and effective, guided them forward. Hours passed with little change in the landscape. White stretched endlessly in every direction. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Kale stayed alert, scanning for movement, for shadows that did not belong. Lyra did the same, her senses sharper than his in some ways. When she stopped suddenly and raised a hand, Kale froze instantly. He trusted her instincts now. In the distance, something moved. Not the predator from before, but smaller shapes shifting beneath the snow. Kale recognized the signs. Pack creatures, not immediately hostile but dangerous if provoked. He gestured slowly, signaling Lyra to stay calm and quiet. Together, they altered their path, giving the creatures a wide space. It worked. The shapes disappeared uninterested. As the day wore on, fatigue began to show. Lyra's movements slowed and her breathing became shallow. Kale noticed immediately. Humans survived by watching for small signs. He stopped and set up a short rest, using a portable windshield and heat pack. Lyra looked surprised but grateful. She had expected to push until collapse. Humans planned for limits instead of ignoring them. As they rested, Kale shared water and food. Lyra hesitated, then accepted. She studied the simple ration carefully before eating. Her people valued efficiency, but even they did not approach survival with this level of careful balance. Humans were different. They prepared for the worst, even when things seemed calm. That foresight impressed her deeply. They continued after resting, and the dark line on the horizon slowly grew larger. Structures became visible. Towers, walls, human-made. Lyra's body tensed as she realized they were approaching more humans. Fear flickered in her eyes again. Kale noticed and slowed his pace, turning to face her. He placed a hand over his chest and then gestured outward, toward the settlement, then back to her. He was telling her as best he could that she was not alone. As they drew closer, movement appeared near the settlement gates. Figures in heavy gear stepped forward, weapons ready but not raised. The guards had seen them. Kale lifted his hands slowly, signaling peace. Lyra stayed close behind him, her body rigid with fear. Stories from her people echoed in her mind, stories of humans as dangerous, unstoppable, violent. The guards approached carefully. When they saw Lyra, there was surprise but not hostility. One of them spoke into a communicator, calling for medical and diplomatic support. No one aimed a weapon at her. No one shouted. They followed protocols. Kale felt relief wash over him. Inside the settlement, warmth and light replaced the endless cold. Lyra stared in awe at the structures, the organized layout, the power systems humming beneath the snow. This was not chaos. This was controlled survival. Humans had taken a world that tried to kill them and carved out safety through planning and cooperation. Medical staff examined Lyra gently, using scanners and non-invasive tools. They moved carefully, respectfully. Kale stayed nearby, watching her reactions. She was tense at first, but slowly she relaxed as nothing bad happened. No one treated her like an enemy. No one treated her like an object. She was treated like a person. Later, as Lyra rested in a warm recovery room, Kale met with the settlement leaders. He explained what had happened, the storm, the predator, the journey. They listened carefully. Humans always listened before deciding. That, too, was a strength. Plans were made to recover Lyra's crashed shuttle and to contact her people. When Kale returned to see her, she looked different, cleaner, rested, but more than that, calmer. When she saw him, she stood and approached without fear. She touched her chest and then gestured toward him, repeating the same motion he had shown her earlier. It was her way of saying trust, alliance. Over the next days, communication improved. Translation software helped bridge the gap. Lyra's story became clear. Her people were explorers, careful and cautious. They avoided direct conflict and relied heavily on advanced technology. When that technology failed, they struggled. Humans were the opposite. Their technology was helpful, but their true strength was adaptability. When things broke, humans improvised. When plans failed, humans created new ones. Lyra shared this realization with her leaders through a long-distance transmission. She told them about Kale, about the hut, about the traps, about the journey across the ice. She spoke of human empathy, of human cooperation, of human courage that did not rely on superiority but on persistence. Her people listened carefully. Assumptions were challenged. For Kale, life slowly returned to routine. He repaired his hut with help from the settlement. The frozen plains no longer felt as lonely. Humans had expanded their reach, but not through force, through endurance, through care. Before Lyra left, she met Kale one last time near the edge of the settlement. Her shuttle had been repaired. Her people were waiting. She looked out over the frozen world and then back at him. "You were not what we were warned about," she said through the translator. "You were more," Kale smiled softly. "We usually are," he replied. They parted as allies, not with grand speeches or ceremonies, but with understanding. Lyra returned to her people carrying a new truth. Humans were not just survivors. They were teachers, builders, friends. As her shuttle lifted into the sky, Kale watched until it vanished among the clouds. Then he turned back toward the frozen plains. The cold was still there. The dangers remained. But humanity would endure, as it always had, not because the universe was kind, but because humans refused to give up. On a world that tried to break them, humans had once again proven why they deserved their place among the stars.